Alrighty, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Should have a mic on either side of the room just for handing around. When you go to raise your hand and speak, please utilize that because it captures it for the internet. Let's go ahead and pray, and we will get started. Father God, we thank you so much for this time and this opportunity we could spend together, and I pray that you would cause us to have good conversations, help us to enjoy our discussion, and I pray that you would enlighten our minds, give us wisdom and understanding as we seek to understand how to communicate your truth in our current day and age, in the world in which we live. We thank you for your grace, Lord. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are on Strange New World, chapter 3, and we've really gotten into the meat and potatoes of the book. This is when Truman essentially starts going through at about the highest level possible and starts treating individual philosophers and trying to give you the broad outlines of their thought, because it is their thought that kind of undergirds or it forms the foundation of our current perspective on the world, our current social imaginary, as he puts it, right? So we have a social imaginary that is really just the air we breathe, right? This is the world in which we live, and you're already going to make fun of my spelling. We just started. We literally just started, right? And so, yes, exactly. We just started. Come on now. I was told it doesn't count when it's on the whiteboard. Yeah, except for when they start laughing at you. That's when it counts, right? But what he's getting at is that these philosophers develop these ideas that they kind of undergird how we think about the world. He speaks of our cultural intuitions. Page 52 in the intro, he says, "We all live in a world where many of their basic ideas are now our cultural intuitions," right? So we're going to go through in depth today Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Wilde as well. And again, ideally, if you're paying attention, you are going to see where we'll be talking about some weird thing that Hegel came up with, and you'll see how this connects to how people view the world today, even if they've never read Hegel or anything like that, okay? So that's kind of the idea, and if you can understand the philosophical movements that lie behind all of this stuff, you can have a better sense of how we ended up where we're at and why the sorts of things people believe today just make intuitive sense to them, that they think, oh, it is just logical that X, Y, Z is the case, right? And we'll talk about some of that, okay? So again, today is Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Wilde. So let's go ahead and start with Hegel. And again, on 52, you can see that Truman notes Hegel is very complicated. If you're trying to understand Hegel and his thought, it's not very easy to understand, right? But Hegel has a lot of complicated ideas, and there are a handful that really form the foundation for Marx, and then, develop into other ideas from there. So let's start out with just digging into Hegel. He talks about this, if you will, this progression, right? This evolution. And for Hegel, there's sort of an evolution of thought or ideas, right? So he doesn't necessarily mean that we have a, biological evolutionary theory in terms of like we all came from slime. Instead, what Hegel is essentially thinking is that over time, human self-consciousness and awareness, they kind of develop as we think about the world and how we relate to the world, etc. And so, the way Truman puts it, the ancient Athenian thought differently from the medieval knight, who thought differently from the Prussian merchants of Hegel's own day. So the idea is we have different thoughts, we have different ideas, and these things evolve over time, and the evolution of these ideas really characterizes or colors what history even is, right? So that's kind of the broad perspective. And again, 52, Truman says, this makes intuitive sense. If we reflect on our own lives, it should be obvious that who we are, how we think, the language we use, the way we interpret certain situations, the manner in which we respond to others, is intimately connected to the other people with whom we interact. Our self-consciousness is shaped by the way in which it engages with the self-consciousness of others and vice versa. These interactions are dynamic and have an effect on us. Thus, we change over time. And so that's Hegel's idea, and he thinks this changing over time is happening for humanity as a whole, right? That this is just occurring over the generations, and we're essentially evolving as a race or a species to a higher ideal, right? So that's kind of Hegel's broad outline or big picture perspective. So what jumped out at you at Hegel? I have some key themes I want to touch on, but if you guys come up with them, it'll be better. Right? So what jumped out at you from this perspective? Did you have any questions you thought of while you were kind of orienting yourself around Hegel and his ideas? It's working.
I can provide some more context on
please.
Hegel in terms of his role in philosophy. So Hegel is often thought of as kind of the father of progressivism. So progressivism in the early 20th century and even modern progressivism. And what you said, Tanner, is absolutely right. There's this idea the whole idea of historical consciousness is something that we get from Hegel, this idea that thought itself develops and progresses over time. And for Hegel, he kind of spiritualizes the development of thought. And so there's this sort of inevitable direction to history. So if you ever heard somebody say to you, you're on the wrong side of history, that's a total Hegelian kind of thing to say, because the idea there is that history has a direction that's going to, that in some ways is inevitable, and hence you're on the wrong side of it, and you don't want to be. So this idea of historicism, of sort of this progression of thought, but also, it connects eventually into class and culture as well, and so it's just obviously where it feeds into Marx, and Marx runs with it. But you have this idea of historical consciousness developing over time, and he also is gonna say, from a philosophical standpoint, that people are bound by their time, and therefore can't really understand people from other times, right? So you actually get out of this progressivism a disdain for reading, classics and liberal arts and so forth, because you can't really understand what Socrates or Plato meant because you're not a 5th century Greek citizen. And so what we do instead, and this is again feeds into the modern world, is instead we make meaning out of the text, right? And so he is very critical of the idea of exegesis, right? I mean, he thinks exegesis is sort of like a joke. It's all eisegesis because of our historical consciousness. So anyway, those are a few thoughts. I'll be quiet for a second.
Nope, that's perfect. I appreciate the context. Good. So what jumped out at you guys when you read a little bit in the chapter? Again, he is flying through. This is the highest level view you can get. We're only getting a handful of paragraphs per thinker, and that's part of the study as I want to flesh them out a little bit more. I guess let's first talk about the evolutionary development of thought, right? Does this strike you as true? Does it strike you as false, somewhere in between? Do you think this is a ridiculous idea?
Hello. I think for me, I thought it was kind of interesting because I've heard of evolutionary development of thought in maybe a slightly different context with the evolution of consciousness from other thinkers. But I felt like the other thinkers viewed it as a more compounded process than just now you kind of have and are limited by this social imaginary of just your time. And so it didn't seem like, to me that was kind of a contrast, I guess, with the context that you just gave, which is helpful because I think in practice, intuitively, I do feel like I experience, even in microcosm in my own life, some evolution of consciousness. Right. And I think that if you look at the development of art and et cetera, it seems to be a pattern. But I kind of disagree with Hegel's interpretation or assumption that you can never understand authorial intent and therefore do away with it. And maybe I'm definitely being reductionistic, but yeah. I just definitely think it's more compounded and than what seems to be presented here.
And for everybody else's context, the evolution of consciousness idea, I believe Jess is referring to Owen Barfield, who is one of the Inklings, right? A good friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And Barfield talks about the evolution of consciousness in some of his writing. And he was a Christian. You know, he talks about it in a fairly compelling way. And so Jess and I were exposed to this, and we were like, oh, there might be something to this, right? And so I had a similar reaction when I read Hegel. I was like, man, I've never even heard of it coming from his perspective or direction, right? And I do think you're right that the way Hegel fleshes it out is a little bit different than the way Barfield fleshes it out, but I noticed a similar thing, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, just to add to it, you know, I think the danger of like kind of a Hegelian point of view. I mean, the other part of this evolution of consciousness and this sort of direction the history is going is the assumption that everything that comes later is better, right? So part of that's where the progressivism comes out. Like progress is good and it's always getting better, and therefore what came before is unenlightened and should be discarded. And you know, Lewis talked about this, like the danger of presentism, right? This idea of we're just sort of trapped in our own society, and we discount the Middle Ages because they're the Dark Ages, or we discount whatever. And I'll just give you an example of this in the field of economics, where this has become a big issue. Is for almost a century, when you did graduate work in economics, you would have to take several classes in the history of economic thought. Like, what have economists thought, and how has economic thought developed, and what sort of things have they done? And that has basically been purged because there were a number of influential thinkers in the mid-20th century who said, well, what do you need to study the history for? Like, everything in the past that's worth knowing is now present in our current theory, and we've just discarded the stuff that's not true. And that is like a microcosm of this sort of progressivism of like whatever norms we had, traditions, habits, if it's no longer around, then it's not worth having.
Yeah, I think that's insightful, and you see that often with the expressive individualistic shift, that there's an assumption that the normativity is what is newer, recent, automatically makes it better or more important, right? I'm just throw this out, this is probably a rabbit trail for this, but I read that Hegel actually either was a student of Adam Smith's or related to him in some way, shape, or form, and I'm curious about that because I know you know a little bit more about him, so if it's not ringing any bells, then no big deal.
He's, I think he read Adam Smith. He's almost a contemporary, not quite a contemporary.
Okay.
I think he comes just a little bit later.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting connection.
Well, and
given the direction he takes everything.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
and again, I don't know if this is germane to our discussion, but like what's interesting about Hegel is he tends to be really influential in kind of, let's say, left of center, left political kind of movements.
Sure.
But he actually, there are some people in kind of political science circles on the right who have kind of like a right-leaning sort of Hegelianism, and there's a lot we could go into that probably is not worth it here in terms of political thought. But he is a very complicated thinker to try to unpack.
Another thing I want to talk about is his approach is called a dialectic, right? And I used this word last time. I mean it slightly differently than Hegel. Hegel had three categories that he roughly utilizes: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? And what these are is, for Hegel, the question is, how does this happen, right? How do these thoughts evolve and the process come about? Well, for Hegel, you have two thoughts or ideas, and they come into conflict with one another, right? And they're kind of like battling it out, if you will. They're kind of duking it out. And then, so one is the thesis, and one is the antithesis. And then they're kind of duking it out, battling it out. And what arises from that is the synthesis, right? And the synthesis is essentially the next thesis. And so now you have the next thesis, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again over time, and that's how all of this evolves. And so let's just take a theological idea. You might have the Trinity, right? Tritheism here. He doesn't apply it, I think, in theological context, but this is how it would work if we were to use Hegel's thought in our approach in theology. You have tritheism, and then you have, tritheism is not the right word. The Trinity, what is it?
No, you're talking about like three separate persons?
Yeah, exactly. It's monotheism, but it's a Trinitarian monotheism. So Trinitarian versus Unitarian, that's what I'm getting at, right? So you might have a Trinitarian approach, and you might have a Unitarian approach. the thesis and the antithesis, they duke it out, and what emerges from them is the synthesis, some sort of happy medium between the two or something like that, and then that synthesis forms the new thesis, and then you do it again, right? And then that's how this happens over time.
And
right.
just to clarify on that
Yes.
point, it would be like, the thesis could be God is three separate persons, three separate entities.
Right,
And
right.
then no, God is one entity. And the synthesis is, well, God is three persons in one entity.
Sure,
Right? Like that
sure.
kind of like, in this example is how you kind of bring those things together in a way. Like you have two very different camps, and then out of it comes this refinement between the two of them to emerge to a more dominant kind of point of view.
Yep. So yeah, go ahead.
Kind of an interesting connection to some current things that I feel like this is based on. There's a new kind of theory, and it's not really new, but it's definitely now much more popular than it was even when I was in school, but it's called dialectical behavior therapy. And so DBT for short, and it's this very much this idea where it's like two polars, right? And it's like, okay, but what if they exist at the same time, what happens? Like if we can be, upset and coping, what is that new thing, right?
Yep.
So kind of what you were drawing there.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that this was based in some of his thought originally.
Yeah, probably. What do you guys think about this process, the dialectic that Hegel talks about here? Yeah.
I'm looking at page 53, and I kept reading over where he keeps saying, human nature is something emerging over time and
Yep.
so forth and so on. But to me, of course, I'm looking at it from, I guess, a Christian perspective. Human nature hasn't changed. We're the same from the beginning of time. So is he saying that it kind of changes and it belongs somewhere else? Or, what's he actually saying there?
Yeah, so if you actually think about the thesis of Truman's book overall, right, he calls it kind of this, we live in this age of expressive individualism, and I think Truman's fundamental thesis has a little bit of this idea in mind. So they're not thinking in terms of original sin, man is sinful, but instead thinking in terms of what are like the thoughts and ideas that motivate or direct man over time, right? And so, for example, Truman's observation that, man, today we seem to live in an age of expressive individualism, very much unlike 100 years ago or 500 years ago. That itself is this man's nature changing over time. Now, Hegel, to your point, assumes it's good, right? Like whatever we're evolving into is great. Truman is just saying it is, right? And he's like, now what are we going to do with it in terms of this expressive individualistic tendency or move in culture and society, right? So I think like what Truman identifies is a part of this emerging nature of man. Doesn't mean man isn't still mired in original sin and in need of a savior. That's all still true, of course. But there's like this, there seems to be this change where man is no longer identifying himself primarily with his roles, duties, obligations in society. Instead, he's much more concerned about how he feels on the inside and how he can express that externally, right?
Well, and part of this might be like the idea of the natural man to the artifactual man or the artificial man, or like the idea that cultural, a lot of what we do as human beings is we sort of dress up and add on to and develop customs. And so, but the question is there nature within that stays the same? Even as we dress it up differently, we wear different clothes, we have different habits and so forth, or is there something fundamentally changing about it? And I don't know on Hegel's part if he would say there's something, he might say there's something fundamentally changing about humanity itself, like in its deepest nature, and not just sort of a custom and culture thing.
Right. And again, this is Truman's summary of him, but the quote you were referring to here, once Hegel placed human self-consciousness at the center and observed how this changes over time, the question of this deeper sense of human nature becomes far more urgent. We might summarize Hegel by saying he saw true, full human nature as something emerging over time, as something to be realized by a historical process that would terminate at some point in the future. This process was one that he characterized as being one of spirit, and that's the fundamental spiritual aspect that you referred to earlier, Paul. So, yeah, great question. Did I see another hand?
I was just going to say that Hegel wasn't anchored to the biblical definition of human nature, right? So he wouldn't have thought that human nature is, okay, here's what God says about it in Genesis 1, and it's not,
Yeah.
we are on this evolving path of kind of self-discovery, and as the wind blows and takes us, we're learning about ourselves, kind of.
Yeah, I think that's a fair description. Yeah.
I think I can kind of struggle with this dialectic model because I think it makes it seem as though there's a happy medium for every argument.
Right.
And it's just not true, right? Like, there's no hard and fast truth in this model, where sometimes the thesis is just it, and the antithesis is wrong, and there's no medium, like
Right.
there is no synthesis.
Yeah. It assumes, which is consistent with his thought, that we haven't got there yet. We still got progress to make, no matter what you're probably talking about, right? Whereas from our perspective, we might say, no, the thesis on any given topic is fundamentally correct and needs no adjustment, right? Like, and that's to the point earlier about, it very much says, hey, look into the past, not really important, et cetera. Whereas if we think the thesis might just be right as proposed, then looking to the past and identifying that thesis is very important, right? So I do want to compare this to my model that I talk about. I think they're different. I think they're fundamentally different, and I'll show you how I think why. This is my little model of epistemology that I talk about all the time. I think what Hegel proposes would actually exist somewhere within this space for me in terms of my model. He would have thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis coming out from those, and that develops your fundamental idea that then gets modified by lived experience, et cetera. But I don't agree with this fundamentally. I actually think if my model is correct, it probably exists also in microcosm so that you do it inside of the generation of your thesis to begin with, right? So it's not taking another antithesis into account. It's taking the full-orbed lived experience, humanity, all that type of stuff, and that's how we iterate on our ideas, right? And so it might bear some superficial similarities, but I think my model is fundamentally different than what Hegel is proposing, right? So I just want to share that because last time I actually used the word dialectic and hadn't read this part yet. So.
Well, I mean, and dialectic has a longer history in terms
Sure.
of its usage, and for like dialogue, and like it's a kind of didactic approach to conversation and knowledge, and he kind of appropriates it in a certain way. I'll just say, and maybe this maybe transition to Marx. Like Marx uses it. Like when I teach students about Marx, the thesis antithesis is a really big part. And what Marx does is he takes this thesis antithesis synthesis and he applies it to cultural dynamics. So he says there's different cultural groups, different kinds of classes, and so for Marx, he takes what for Hegel is very much about thought, and he takes it and applies it to his understanding of history.
Right.
And the way in which societies develop and cultures develop. You have different factions and the thesis, antithesis, and there's all this struggle. I mean, he has very kind of vivid language about history being driven by struggle and conflict and then new things emerging out of that. And so anyway, so that's kind of one way that Marx goes with this, is kind of taking that, what Hegel thought about in terms of thought, and applying it to kind of historical development.
Yeah. No, I think it's really good. And I want to touch on one more Hegelian idea before we move to Marx, and that is his idealism, okay? His idealism, I think, is really important. What do you guys think of when you hear the word idealism?
Just our own slapdash definition?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm setting you up for failure. I'm
Perfect.
pretty sure you're gonna
I'll
get it wrong.
take the hit. I love it. I'm in. I think idealism is almost like this very purist form of understanding and imagination, where you are striving for some out-of-reach goal that can't actually be actualized.
Right.
But it's directional in its usage.
Yeah. I think when we often use the phrase, that person is idealistic, for example, that's often what we mean, something like that. Yeah. It's not necessarily what idealism is in a philosophical sense, but it's related, right? And this goes back to what Paul said earlier when Hegel spiritualizes everything. Everything can be reduced to spirit, right? That's a bit of the ideal. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is I'm going to call this one-thingness, okay? One-thingness. And I totally spelt it right. I want to say that invented word is spelled correctly. What I mean by one-thingness is idealism often reduces everything down to one thing, if that makes sense. And what Hegel reduces everything down to is spirit. If you look at the history of philosophy, you can often see this tendency to be reductionistic and reduce everything down to a specific category. And this is often called in philosophy the problem of the one and the many. Okay, it's more of a metaphysical problem than anything else. But the problem of the one and the many identifies the fact that as we are trying to boil down reality to its most fundamental or foundational part, there is often a tendency to reduce everything down to a singular thing or to reduce everything down to many particular things, okay? And so in the history of philosophical thought, one of the first movements that reduced everything down to the many is atomism, right? And this is where we get our modern-day idea atom from. Now, atomism comes from even pre-Socratic philosophy, right? Like this is prior to Plato and all that type of stuff. But this idea that everything is made up of tiny little individual particulates, okay? And that's what builds everything out. That's the many, right? And the reason I'm bringing all this up is Hegel's idealism is a representation of the one, right? He boils everything down to one idea, and that is spirit. Everything is spirit, okay? And I wanted to bring this up because the one thingness move that Hegel makes is a similar move that Marx makes when we step into him. He just changes what the one thing is. Okay, so he does one thingness also, but instead of making it spirit, right, he instead focuses on the political class struggles and power dynamics, right? And then that's his one thingness. But they're still both fundamentally doing the same thing, right? What navigates in between these ideas is in metaphysical spheres often called realism, which I think is a more consistently Christian approach. The idea that, yes, there is one, right? The one true God, for example, the foundation of all things, but there's also the many. He has created all of us in his image, right? And so, anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because his idealism, I think, is an important aspect that Marx kind of picks up and runs with. So,
Can I ask a
yes,
question?
please.
So I would define idealism as a focus on the best thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm wondering, like Hegel and Marx, are they claiming that this one thing that they're focusing, are they claiming that that's the best thing?
I'm not sure they would say best. I think they would say like, and it might be different between Hegel and Marx. When I'm thinking about Hegel, I don't think he would like pass a moral judgment on it. I think he would just say it is, that like spirit is the foundation of everything, right? Like whether you like it or not.
Like the most important thing.
Yeah. Like really, he could reduce everything. It's kind of reductionistic, right? Like he essentially would reduce everything down to spirit. Idealism is actually a form of monism. And monism is extremely prominent in Eastern religion and thought. So if you ever hear a Hindu or Buddhist say, the material world is just an illusion, right? That's like a big idea in Eastern thought. It comes from monism. This is all an illusion because all that exists is really just the mind of God, right? And so they reduce everything down to spirit, the spiritual aspect, but it's one thing. It comes from monism, right? And so idealism is a subcategory of monism, really. But he pursues in a slightly different way than a typical Eastern Buddhist or Hindu would, right? But it's the same fundamental thing, that everything is one thing and that one thing is spirit. I don't know if Hegel would say, material reality is an illusion, but it really does come from the same idea, right?
One more quick point I was just looking up for Hegel. The other big thing to note, and I know that he doesn't talk about Kant at all, but like Hegel is sort of like the anti-Kant, Immanuel Kant, and like a lot of what he's doing is responding to Kant's way of structuring reality and philosophy.
Yeah.
So.
And Kant is, very pivotal figure. Again, right. Truman doesn't treat him very much, but he's very, very important figure. Cool. So let's stop with Hegel here, but these are some of the ideas I wanted to put in front of you. The dialectic theme, evolutionary development of thought, his idealism that is really a form of monism. Now let's go on to Marx. Am I going to hit the pulpit? I never plan ahead, y'all. Every week, 30 minutes into the lesson, I have to move the pulpit. Now, Marx makes up a good chunk of the chapter, right? And with good reason, okay? Really, discussion of Marx starts on 54 and continues well into 59, right? With some subcategories and themes. So, Marx, I'm not going to go through a bunch of these quotes. I have tons of quotes here regarding Marx and some of Marx's thoughts and ideas. But again, we're just going to grab big themes. So again, the one thingness, continues from Hegel into Marx, but he makes that one thing something slightly different, right? And the one thingness for Marx is, as Truman puts it here, Marx is more of a materialist, right? And so I do have a quote here from 54. While Hegel is what we call an idealist and interested in the intellectual spirit of the age, the ideas that gave it its distinctive shape, Marx is a materialist. And so, honestly, you would, if you were to map it out in terms of metaphysics, you'd probably say Marx is much more in line with, the many, right? The atomism kind of approach. But really, you can see Marx boils down his one idea, and this is more consistent with how you were using the phrase, Catherine, is Marx boils down the idea to just this fundamental class, political / class warfare struggle stuff, right? So he takes Hegel's idea of the dialectic, and yeah, we're doing that, but we're doing that on a political level, right? So again, Marx is continuing this one thingness theme, but his one thing is different, okay? And I wanted to bring that up. So the dialectic, given this, the dialectic makes everything about power. And again, I think this is very relevant to our current day and age, because this is, you hear this as like an assumption in so much of our political dialogue and things like that everybody is just playing a power game, right? That's all that's really going on. That's all that really exists is just power. Who has control? Who has authority? Who's in charge? And, they want to keep it that way. I actually had a conversation. I wanted to bring this up to you guys and see what you guys think. I was having a conversation with somebody this week, and we were talking about Christianity and religion in general, and they said this. They said, look, people who have power, authority, and money, they want that. They want to keep it, and so they establish a set of rules to maintain that position, and that's all religion is. Religion is just a power game so that the people in charge can, essentially rule over those who are not in charge and utilize power to try and control them, right? So really, religion is just a power game for control. Yep. And so that's where you get, and it really is a Marx idea, right? And it's quoted in this section. He doesn't use that exact phrase, at least as I read it, but, the opium of the people, right there. So religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. 57, right? And again, the way it's often put today is opiate of the masses. And I don't know what language he originally wrote in. It could be a perfectly good translation. So, but this is a common idea. I literally had a conversation with an unbeliever this week, and that was their critique. They said religion is ruled by people that want to keep their control, want to keep their money, and they use the rules of religion to keep people in check so that they can maintain their position. What do you guys think about that idea? Lots of thoughts. We'll start with Shirley.
I don't have a religion. I have a faith, and there's a difference.
Yep.
And when you look at the word religion, yeah, it might mean that, but that's not, to me, a true faith, because that's just me.
I'll tell you what I told him in short in a second. I think you'll resonate with it.
I just think it's funny coming from the people who label religious people or conservatives, I suppose, conspiracy theorists. I can't think of a larger conspiracy than that. And if you try to think it out, who would have the motive to do this? It really doesn't math out. To me, at least, I'm kind of slow, but yeah.
Yeah, I hear what you mean, right? So if you ever hear a conspiracy theorist go on about the fact that the earth is flat or we didn't land on the moon or anything like that, one of the primary critiques of a conspiracy is how many people would have to be in on it for that to maintain its, position. So if we didn't really land on the moon, presumably thousands upon tens of thousands of people would know because they were in, and yet they all kept the secret. Nobody actually pointed out. So this is a common critique of conspiracy theory. And to your point, religion then, if this is all it is, forms the grandest, most crazy conspiracy that ever came across humanity. And so to that point, I think it is a fairly simplistic way of treating it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that would take a pretty awful person to pull this off. And like, what awful person convinces the masses to be good people? It just doesn't make sense to me. I'll stop. You know.
That's awesome. I love it. Good. Other thoughts on this idea that religion is the opiate of the masses, and it's all power games and power dynamics, and it's all just for controlling small-minded people so they don't rise up and overthrow us?
Well, I don't know if you're going to go this direction, but like the relevance, like the main relevance of Marx today is the morphing into cultural Marxism, which probably makes sense to talk about here.
Yeah.
But what he'll say, and especially what Nietzsche will say, is that they have this kernel of truth. Like when they look at religion and the rules of religion, and like what Christ teaches in the faith, that they recognize, the people who are astute recognize that there are certain constraints on how you behave, right? How men ought to behave, how women ought to behave, like having families culturally, and so it becomes. It's interesting they apply it to people, right? People exercising that control, and certainly you have abuses at different points in individual churches. But the religion itself they see as an exercise of control because it does control, if you will, or modify people's behavior, and it limits their freedom, right? In a sense, in this kind of unconstrained. Okay, freedom is just being able to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want, which is kind of a corrupt view of freedom. But
Sure.
If that's your view, then yeah, religion's a big problem because as you know, there's all kinds of constraints on what you should do and how you should do it and what you shouldn't do. So I think that they're picking up on maybe the worst elements or the worst, like they highlight the worst sort of instances of that, and they kind of attribute it to all of religion and say, well, it's just being run by people at the top to do this and control others.
And I think what you highlighted is a common theme in the whole chapter. Nietzsche rails against the limitations that we're going to put on people, and Wilde does the same, right? And so I think that's a key theme. And what I would go back to, and I talked about this in both the previous two lessons, and I keep coming back to this on this whole movement, is it assumes there is no sin nature. It assumes morality doesn't exist or is just relative, and that you don't actually have to behave in certain ways. There's nothing that you need to overcome in terms of your personal nature. So it assumes if constraints are being placed on you, that they're automatically bad, right? And it's like, no, that might be perfectly good because I have a sin nature, and that sin nature needs to be purged by the Holy Spirit and transformed, right? But that's what this movement continues to get wrong, in my opinion. Just the assumption that the sin nature doesn't exist, and whatever you feel or want to express is inherently good in and of itself. That's just not true, period. I don't even think you have to read the Bible to find out that's not true. You just have to look yourself in the mirror and genuinely consider your own actions, behaviors, and life, right? And I think anyone who is honest with themselves would admit, I am not everything that I could be, want to be, strive or aspire to be, right? And of course, the Bible helps a lot, but yeah, go ahead.
But they also would say, well, it's wrong to murder and it's wrong to steal. So they still have some constraints. It's just that in the area they want to do what they want to do, there's no constraint.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm gonna talk about that when we get to Nietzsche. Okay.
I was going to say, like, Marx's point is on page 57 about how basically what he's saying, kind of Paul said this a little bit too just now, but like the reason religion is controlling is because it's, what's the line here? That which is convenient, even necessary for maintaining the world of the factory owner is disguised as a non-negotiable imperative rooted in the character and command of God. But I would push back, like we have been here, by suggesting that, like, it depends on the religion maybe, because Christians are a problem for corrupt business leaders and corrupt politicians, and because they're going and making families, teaching them the truth, and really maybe that's the reason why, is like when we have families and teach them truth, they're the ones that are spotting corruption and sin and untruth in the workplace, in society. And so it's like the idea that religion is that force that the factory owner can utilize to kind of control people. It's like, I totally would say that's the opposite, unless it's a bad religion maybe, So it's like Marx just doesn't understand that conflict maybe either.
Yeah, there's certainly he's painting with a broad brush, right? When he says all of religion does this thing, it's really hard to make that case.
Christian families are hard to deal with, right? That's like, yeah.
No, sure, absolutely.
And I think to kind of piggyback on that
Sure.
and add another layer of nuance, it's another reductionistic presentation of Christianity though too, or religion, because even within a religion, who perfectly expresses that religion? Like in Christianity, we have, those who profess Christ, but fall into the Matthew 7 category of are just professing and trying to, perform the faith, but don't actually have the transformation. And some of those people really might do this unhealthy pattern and,
Yeah.
give Christians a bad name. And then there are plenty of Christians who truly are transformed and who are, being sanctified and are still imperfect in the process, but are trying. And so it's hard because there's also this ideal of anyone who ascribes to said religion is going to be a perfect exemplar of it. And it's no, you don't have room at all for margin here. And that's not realistic. But I guess if you're idealistic, you're not trying to be a realist. So
there's a twist and a tension on what you were raising earlier, Tanner, about saying, well, of course we recognize in ourselves that if we just give free rein to whatever we want all the time, we have a sense that might not end well. But from a cultural standpoint, going back to Hegel, right, we don't really know. Like the historical development, historical consciousness, part of how it advances, it requires experimentation and requires innovation. And so what do we hear when you put constraints on how people want to live, right? You're stifling creativity, you're repressing them, you're preventing cultural development. And so part of, someone who's in this strain of thought, part of why they value freedom is because they have this view of progress and we need to allow for experimentation, and that's part of creativity. And so they see all these things as going together, even if sometimes the experiments don't go well, even if the experiments kind of cut against what came before. The point is, what matters is the progress and the newness, the direction. And to do that, you have to not have these traditional constraints, these legal constraints, these biblical constraints on behavior.
Sure. And I would partially agree with some of that, to be honest. But the thing I don't like is the all or nothing nature of that approach, right?
Well, and that's the tension. So the twist is how they would view it kind of in a cultural development standpoint. But the tension is this of how do you, what are the realms where creativity makes sense?
Right.
What are the realms where you don't want to just sort of nail everything down because God made us to grow and develop? And so that's where we have to navigate the
Right.
tension of not the, okay, everything goes, experiment with whatever you want.
Right.
But then also, how do we have a kind of openness to learning and maturing and growing and being creative as well? And so I think there's a tension there from a Christian standpoint, but from, again, this sort of historicism standpoint, that just gets in the way.
Yeah. And, again, an underlying current in this entire chapter is the jettisoning of ethics and some sort of objective moral standard, right? You can see over and over that that's kind of gone out the window. And to me, that's where everything goes off the rails, right? I've shared many times in previous studies and, would share here, there's some aspects of each of these, okay, the dialectic, there's some, I can see what he's getting at, right there. But when you jettison certain ideas, you just go completely off the rails, even if you had a few good thoughts along the way, right? And so that's where my concern is, right? And to me, that's where the foundations of the Christian faith, there's almost no doctrine more foundational to Christianity than original sin, right? And, well, man, you deny that and you end up in all these pretty bad areas, right? Not to take pot shots, but when I had talked to my friend, and he said, it's just rules designed to rule over people and have power and money and authority and all that type of stuff. I just said, you just named why I'm not Roman Catholic, right? And not that I'm, right. And I want to be clear, Roman Catholicism also, has some good ideas and good things to offer. I've read many Roman Catholic authors with benefit. But in terms of fundamental structure, I think Protestantism much more embraces that kind of spirit of freedom and, focuses on the individual and their relationship with Christ a little bit more than Roman Catholicism does, which kind of, to me, has that more structured system that you need to fit into, right? So anyway, it was an interesting conversation. Let's continue on.
One more, if I can bring
Yes,
one more
please.
thing with Marx that I think is relevant here, and it kind of ties into Rousseau that we talked about a couple weeks ago. One of the things that Marx is really known for is the idea of false consciousness, which is kind of a weird idea until you understand sort of how he thinks about the world. And so he is very much a materialist, and so he has this sort of breakdown of like how we think and what we think about, and he argues, because he's a materialist, that all thought emerges from economic and social relationships. And so part of why he's critical of capitalism and the bourgeois, like bourgeois is this kind of class, but it's kind of this way of thinking that emerges out of being a factory owner, out of being a shopkeeper. And so he has this discussion about in terms of our thoughts, the superstructure versus the substructure. And so he says a lot of what people think is just this sort of superstructure, it's this false consciousness where they don't really realize what's going on underneath. And this is tied into, I mean, to take the common term of wokeness, right? I mean, what is wokeness about? And to some extent, it's about awaking from a false kind of consciousness. And there's actually, a friend of mine wrote an essay about, how there are a lot of really famous movies from the last 20 years that are basically developing this. So what is The Matrix about, right? You're walking around and all of a sudden you're discovering, oh, actually I'm inside this matrix and I don't know what's going on. Or Fight Club, or you can list, and he kind of goes through all these movies where the theme of the movie is you think everything is okay, but actually it's not okay, and you just need to realize it's not okay. And I mean, what better definition of kind of awakening or wokeness is there? And it's tied into this kind of false consciousness idea that he talks about.
It reminded me of mimesis. I've talked a little bit about mimesis and how we essentially get we borrow our desires or our wants, the things we think of as goods that I need to achieve. We borrow them from each other, right, in culture and society. I think there's some truth to that, right? So again, potentially some truth to these ideas along the way. Another one, we don't have time to go into it, but another one that's talked about in the chapter is alienation. And I think there's some truth to this, right? He talks about alienation. He says the worker does not experience the fruit of his labor. So you slave all day in a factory making a chair, and then you're given paper that you use to go buy food, right? And he's like, there's a disconnect that happens there. You don't ever get to sit in the chair you make, right? And I think there's some truth to this, right? Like there's an enjoying the fruits of your labor that we've kind of lost in our industrialized society, right? And so he talks about this alienation piece, the fact that you're not really connected to the fruits of your labor. Somebody goes hunting, for example, in our day and age. They hunt the game. Either they process it partially or in whole, and then it gets processed another way. But then you eat the deer you shot, right? Like there's something amazing about that, right? I don't know how many cows I've eaten in my life. I never killed a cow, right? But I have eaten so many cows, but that's the thing, this separation between like your labor and the fruit of the labor is something he brings up. And I think there might be something to that. Again, the creativity and, being made in the image of God and being able to be creative and make things.
What does he say is the consequence of that? Like, what's the effect? Like, he identifies it as a phenomena, but like, what's his point of, okay, this is happening, and thus?
Yeah, he says alienation at its simplest refers to the feeling that leaves us at odds with our surrounding. That's kind of what he puts. So it's almost like it's part of the whole economic and social structures piece, like in how everything relates, but like you're at odds with your surrounding. For Marx, alienation is specifically connected to human beings in relation to economic considerations. A man feels alienation, so it's part of your feeling, like you feel alienated or separated in some way, shape, or form. I don't know, we might describe it as feeling lost or broken, or maybe we would tie it to our modern day midlife crisis or something like that, this kind of concept that there's some disconnect or brokenness. And for him, a man feels alienation because he is alienated from the fruits of his labor, right?
Yeah,
I get that, but I'm just saying, what does that lead to?
Well, it leads to sort of unhappiness, misery, discontent, and it also ties into other terms. So the medieval term for it is acedia or acedia, and then the more modern French term is ennui, which is sort of a kind of, or ennui. I don't think it's ennui. Okay, I'm corrected, ennui. Can you spell it? Okay, that's what I'm thinking of. So it's a listlessness, a purposelessness, a restlessness,
French, but not
uncertainty. And so his argument is that modern industrial production and specialization encourages this kind of listlessness, and you see it a lot in especially upper echelon kind of families, like children of wealthier people often, not just that, but they especially struggle with feelings of guilt, uncertainty. What am I trying to do? Where do I fit in? So it's a loss of a lot of purpose. in the kind of work that you do.
And I wonder,
Oh, I was just going to jump in.
I might steal your thunder. You go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, and I think the result of that is, at least what I've seen in society right now, is they just want to deconstruct everything, but they're actually not offering a positive alternative. So they aren't really offering, from what I've seen, and I could be completely off base here, but I don't see a positive platform or sort of reconstruction or anything of the sort that would answer that, except for just destroy what is because we don't like it and it's not working. And I think that's one of the great flaws of Marxism, in my opinion, is it actually doesn't offer some sort of true, satisfying answer that furthers human flourishing. It just says tear it down.
Well,
Does he even say this is bad, or does he just say it's a consequence?
I think he assumes it's bad, and the goal is for the worker to overtake the means of production,
Yeah,
right?
Okay, yeah, that's where I think I was getting at. Is like, what's his ultimate
He
end game?
has a
there?
lot of harsh things to say about capitalists.
Sure. Okay.
A lot of harsh things.
I was reading a book by, I think, Jack London. I just picked it up randomly, and I did not understand, like, political background or anything. And then, like, the book turned into just it was just Marxist propaganda for, like, 50 pages, right? And I was like, what am I reading? I don't understand this, right? So anyway, Iron Heel, if you're really interested in Marxist propaganda, read Iron Heel. It was fantastic. No, I dropped it. But what I was going to say is I think this leads to a sort of pendulum swing in our day and age in terms of return of the homesteading movement. You see a lot of people, especially Christians, who are like, I am going to go start my own homestead, right? And they're connecting themselves to the work of their hands, right? So I don't know, very interesting.
I know.
Yep,
So
go
I
ahead.
know you want to move on. I mean, I do wonder when it would fit to have a conversation about cultural Marxism. I mean, I could give you like a 3-minute cliff note here if you want to move on, or if you want to have a different conversation. But like that's actually, I think, what's more important
Sure.
today than anything.
I think bring it up.
Okay.
Yep, the 3-minute.
Yeah. So Marx writes in the 1800s, and his view is very materialistic. And for Marx, kind of like for Hegel, so Hegel thought, history is progressing and you can't stop it. It's just happening. And for Marx, he thought communism was that the forces of capitalism would actually eat itself, destroy itself, and that the communist utopia was inevitable. Turned out not to be the case, right? Like we didn't move into communism. And so a bunch of Marxist thinkers in the early 20th century kind of were getting together and thinking through, okay, why didn't the communist utopia happen? Why didn't what Marx predicted happen in terms of the collapse of capitalism and this new utopia? And their conclusion is, well, you know what? Marx really left out the idea of culture, and he didn't account for the resistance culturally that people would have to this communist utopia. And the resistance took place primarily within family and religion. And so the cultural Marxist says what we need to do is we need to rework and change the sort of cultural institutions that were sort of resistant to sharing everything in common, not having rules of property, not valuing the family. And so what you saw in the 1930s and beyond is the development of cultural Marxism in different manifestations. But you see it in the deconstructionist movement. You see it in Foucault. You see it in this development that powers what's important. What we really need to do is sort of capture and change institutions and change how people think about reality. And so it's not really about market forces driving things anymore. It's back to the realm of ideas, and we're going to be very intentional about trying to rework the culture around us to be more conducive to a communist utopia.
And is it?
Yes, that's right. In a huge way they do this is by changing definitions, changing the definitions of words, changing language, and redefining things is
Sure.
a big part of how they do this.
And I'm guessing this is what feeds into the phrase that many of us probably have heard, that communism has never been done correctly, right?
That's part of it.
Is that the part they've left out? Is that cultural transformation piece, right?
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it.
Okay. Let's one final thing I just wanted to say on him. Because of all of this, and I think this is what Truman is getting at in his introduction of Marx, amongst other things, but one of the primary things is everything becomes political, Because, like, why should somebody's sexual orientation be a big political issue, right? And I think he's tying it back to Marx in this way, because for Marx, everything is politics. That's his one thingness, right? Like, everything boils down to politics, and it's all power, class struggles, and warfare, you know? And so in our day and age, this is kind of like a carryover from him, that you can't seemingly have a single thought at Thanksgiving without it being political, right? You comment on the weather and global warming comes up or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, you can't talk about anything without it being a political issue in some way, shape, or form. And I think Truman is making the case that is partially due to Marx, right? So, cool. Let's move on now to Nietzsche. So let's connect him to Marx. What is the will to power? I know it's not brought up in the chapter here, but it's very much associated with Nietzsche. The will to power.
Manifesting.
What's that?
You're going to manifest it.
You're going to manifest it. Yes.
Manifesting.
There you go. Other thoughts beyond that? There is that sense, right? Like, you're going to go out and make it happen. And this is tied to his Übermensch, right? Idea. What's the Übermensch? Superman, right? And not the Clark Kent version, okay? A very different version of Superman for Nietzsche, right? So for Nietzsche, I think he carries over Marx's power dynamic ideas, and he just has this will to power idea that as an individual, we have this high ideal of the Übermensch, the Superman, okay? And they come in and they get what they want or need through power, and very explicitly. So for Nietzsche, much of like morality and, you know, all of these ties to virtue and ethics, etc. These are just, again, these are like oppressive ways that powerful men are are put in their place, right? And so what he essentially says is the Superman, the Übermensch, has no regard for that, right? Is not interested in that, doesn't, really pursue that, and instead he manifests his own destiny, his own desires, his own will. He goes and makes it happen however he needs to, right? And he's not going to be bound or constrained by societal demands or rules that essentially tell him, oh, you shouldn't act that way or you shouldn't act this way. Why? Why shouldn't I act that way or this way, right? And so, of course, this is tied to some of his other ideas. We'll get to the madman in a second, but before that, given this framework, what did Nietzsche think about Christianity? Shirley will tell us.
He wasn't in favor of it at all, I can
Right.
guarantee you from what he said.
Right.
It was almost a laughable matter, he just, yeah.
Not a big fan.
No.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was very explicit. I mean, he said Christianity is a slave religion.
Right.
Like Christianity, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about a method of control. For him, Christianity is a religion of slaves and slavery used to control the powerful.
Right.
And he kind of, with the will to power, it's a little bit more than just rule of the strong. Because for Nietzsche, there's like a moral dimension to it, because he's kind of, again, accepted that there is no kind of moral code, there's no objective ethics, there's nothing. And so, what's left? Well, what's left is you have to form and be true to your own set of ethics, and there's a kind of courage to looking into the abyss, if you will, that there are no set of ethics, there's no objective truth out there, and then sort of forging your own kind of set of ethics and living by that and not being constrained by arbitrary rules, religions, other people. And so that's the kind of this will to power. So it's really the exercise of will, or having a powerful will, particularly oriented towards a kind of moral creation, right, of like sort of generating your own sense of what's right and wrong and living according to that.
And comparing Buddha and God and that's kind of what he does, Buddha's dead, and yet he still, rules or does whatever. And if there's a God and he's dead, he's still, I mean, to me, that was just too much for me.
Right. He puts that comparison in a couple ways. We'll get to the God is dead claim here in a second. On this, for like, if you look at certain Christian virtues, right, these are the ones I think that he often is so opposed to, like compassion. Like, why should you be compassionate, right? Like, that just keeps the strong, powerful man down because, he is, compassionate for others who haven't earned it. They haven't deserved it, right? Things like sacrifice, right? Yeah, humility. All of these fundamental aspects of Christianity are the things that I think are most abhorrent to him, is, these sorts of, self-denial, self-control.
Meekness.
Meekness, self-denial. All of these I think are the things that he really has problems with, right? So, yes, I think I would, because
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm not sure, like, the self-denial and self-discipline, I think, can actually be useful tools, right? And if you see, so if you think about, like, the blogosphere, the what do you call it, the alt-right sphere, whatever, you see some of the non-Christian leaders there building off of self-denial and self-discipline,
yeah.
right? It's like, that's, like, part of how they become something impressive.
Yeah, so that could even be incorporated into a Nietzschean perspective, perhaps. But in general, I think the idea or the question of, why should you have self-denial or self-discipline is definitely one that would be raised, right? And if they could think that it somehow makes them more powerful or something like that, then they would probably approach it. But, for the sake of others or something like that, it's silly idea. Why would you do that? Now, the madman speech, I think, is actually really enlightening and helpful. Nietzsche has a critique of the unbeliever, actually, when he points out the whole madman narrative, right? And you can read it. Truman kind of quotes it in full. This whole sense of the madman running around the town square. God is dead. God is right. I seek God. I seek God. They didn't believe him. They're yelling at him, etc. We've killed God. All this type of stuff. And what I think Nietzsche offers that I think is valuable, independent of these ideas and stuff like that, is what Nietzsche I think is pointing out is not that I want to kill God or that we should kill God. He's pointing out we have essentially excised God from the realm of philosophical thought and discussion. And I think one of his fundamental points is, and you don't realize the implications of that, right? The implications of that have not really caught up. We mentioned earlier, the idea of different like morals, and people believing like, oh, I shouldn't kill, I shouldn't, steal, all this type of stuff. Nietzsche's point is once you kill God, you lose that moral oughtness. It ain't there anymore. Right? And so it's whatever you want to make it to be, right? You create your own moral code, right? Because God isn't there to give it to you, And I think what Nietzsche points out is that a lot of his contemporaries had already killed God in terms of their philosophy, but they still had the lingering effects of a Christian morality and were essentially executing those, clinging onto them, etc., with no clue the consequences of their actions in terms of removing God from the system. And I think that played itself out over time, right? This effect of killing God. Nietzsche, in this sense, is almost prophetic of what's going to happen 50, 100 years from him, because now we are seeing the consequences of killing God, and the full-blown moral relativism and all that type of stuff has taken, full hold of the culture and society, right? So, go ahead.
Yeah, I felt like this was the most important line of the whole book when he says, if you displace God, if you kill him, then everything changes. Nothing can stay the same. There's no moral stability to the universe. There's nothing greater to which the individual must or even be held accountable, because it's like undergirding everything that happens in this book from afterwards, and just what we're living now. Like, there is exactly what you just said there, where there's no ought, there's no moral objectivity, and it's like everything flows from that. So it's kind of amazing that he does recognize it, and I feel like anyone who's come before him was like Marx and any of the questions we have, that's all in light of, well, it's all relative now, and Nietzsche's the one who just like says it straight up. But like everything that comes from this or is in this book just flows from that idea, I feel like.
Yeah, and that's on 62. You cannot dispense with God or shove
Yeah.
him to the margins or make him nothing more than a necessary presupposition for morality. If you displace God, if you kill him, then everything changes. Nothing, absolutely nothing can stay the same. Most pointedly, there is no moral stability in the universe, right?
I would also add, like, I feel when I learned about the Ubermensch, you know, it was presented a little more just in that kind of, oh, it's the Superman, okay? But like later on page 63 at the bottom, he kind of says how he explains how there is that moral consequence of it, where he says, you know, we're freed of the burden of having these moral oughts now, so go and create. And like that, it's not just some tough, strong guy, you know, or the powerful white guys who became the Nazis, kind of like that's how we're learning in public school or whatever. It's much more tied to that, and it's like, oh, I wonder why this was not explained to me like this, and it's because we're living in this society now too, where it's the Your Truth movement, all those kinds of things, and it's like completely illogical when you think about it for a couple of seconds, you know, just like if it's relative, like that doesn't, it just means anything goes kind of a little bit. So I don't even understand how that can survive, that idea of moral relativism, just like, except for the fact that humans are just kind of so evil, we like it, right? We want to actually just be a God unto ourselves. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of it is that, you know, that it almost ties into what you preached on Sunday, that there's a difference often between what we believe intellectually and the way that we act. And so a lot of morality is learned through behavior and circumstance and culture. And so you're absolutely right. Like if you actually press people, like you try to reason it, you know, relativism falls apart very, very quickly and you can't hold that position. And yet lots of people who would kind of sort of take that position, they've grown up in a culture where certain things are right and wrong or certain settings are right and wrong. And so, you know, you jump on X or wherever, and people have lots of opinions about what's right and wrong all the time because as human beings, we make judgments, and that's what we've learned to do from, you know, infancy. Like that's what, growing up, you make judgments, this, not that, this way, go that way, that was right, that was wrong, I got punished for this, I didn't get punished for that. So we sort of imbibe a certain kind of tacit morality, and now people have no grounding. They have no metaphysics and no like ethics that really hold it together. And so this is where the emotivism comes in, right? So what happens? We express kind of what we feel, and a lot of it is done unconsciously or implicitly, and you know, you kind of navigate and you have a conversation with people, and it's like, well, I just kind of feel this way, or I kind of feel that way. I mean, that's how a lot of people, I mean, really most of us act most of the time. And so that's why it's important to have metaphysics and logic, but that also sort of educate how we feel about things so that we have the right kind of reactions and responses to things, because that's often how we're responding. We're not going through lots of steps of logic. What should I do in this case? What's the right response? Okay, let me start with my metaphysics and like work through, okay, 5 minutes later, this is the right response. Or it's just you react, right? And what is your reaction? And so that tacit element, I think, is really important in people behaving as if morality exists, but not having any structure for it, formal structure for it.
Yeah, and in this sense, I think it's caught, not taught, in terms of our moral, ethical, you know, orientation. And here's Nietzsche's point. If you start teaching the opposite, it's eventually going to catch up to the caught part, right? That your superstructure, your societal norms and rules, et cetera, are eventually going to be affected. So that was his point, I think, with the madman. You've changed your teaching. You don't realize how this is going to impact the implicit, tacit ethics that you currently hold, because now they're not tenuous, right? So anyway, very important.
Well, and this, I mean, this ties in a lot to sort of liberalism in Christianity. I mean, so one of the challenges with the Enlightenment, so you know, Scottish Enlightenment is something I've studied, and one of the challenges, there's all this sort of interesting ideas going on. You have the rise of a whole school of theology in Scotland called the moderates, and to our modern eye, they look really good in terms of not putting people to death for blasphemy and, like, you know, being a lot more sort of moderate in their name. But when you probe into it, you begin to say, do they still really believe Jesus is God? And like, do they still really believe? So they act very Christian. They have this sort of external caught. They've grown up in a very Christian culture, and they still affirm elements of it, but they sort of are hacking away at the roots, and they don't know that the tree is going to die 50, 80 years down the road.
Yep. I wanted to ask, and then I have another example from this week, from the same conversation, which was fantastic. Is moral relativism a necessary result of the death of God? And so the way I would ask that is Nietzsche right? Is Nietzsche's madman correct? At least at this point. We obviously don't necessarily agree with everything he said, but is he right at this point? Is moral relativism a necessary result of the death of God, like the madman is proclaiming in the village square? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know how you don't have moral relativism without God.
Right? And
What
that's
the other option would be.
And that's the claim that many Christian apologists make. But that's why I'm asking. I want us to kind of consider it. Because, again, this is intuitively not the case for many unbelievers out there. They feel like you. How often do you hear, oh, you can be a good moral person without believing in God, right? You hear that all the time, right? That's not what Nietzsche's madman is saying, right? Go ahead.
I think that the main case for morality is some authority that is outside of yourself. And any authority that is outside of yourself, but that is still man-made, it's like made by people, right? So, the president is elected, the teacher is hired, right? Like someone is put into that position. And if you don't assent that, like your parents have some kind of moral authority over you because they birthed you. Like it still, in a way, is just like a human creation of authority. And if all people are part of humanity, then there is no authority above the person. And so I think you always end up at moral relativity if you don't have some authority that comes not from people.
Other thoughts?
Well, and I would add, there's no authority above humanity itself, right? And so this is where you get like the will of the people, and the expression of the people is sort of like being this highest thing. I will say, like, there aren't very many people who I think can hold to this, but there is like an Aristotelian approach where you can argue, and I've heard people argue this, that there are moral laws just like there are natural laws. So like gravity exists and rules of chemistry exist, and so why is it such a stretch to think, given that nature has all of this structure and that we are a part of nature, that there are also not moral kinds of rules or ethical kind of structures that we ought to discover and respect, just the way you should respect gravity or chemistry or other kinds of things. Again, I think the question behind that is, well, how do you know that and where does it come from?
Right.
Which is why a lot of people move into Christianity when they go this route. But I think there are some people who are kind of agnostic on God's existence who would still maybe hold to more of that kind of nature, like ethics comes from nature and there's some kind of structure there, just like there's structures of natural laws and physics and so forth.
And this natural law idea is kind of what I'm leaning into at times when I say things like, God's rules are not arbitrary. This is how his world works. This is how it functions. He's not just making stuff up and saying, you have to follow this. What he's saying is there are natural consequences if you disobey these rules, right? And so that there is a bit of natural law theory that is at play if you take that approach. Not saying that gets rid of the need for God, or that God also telling us or commanding us what to do and not to do is not also applicable, but I also think God's rules are embedded in reality too, if that makes sense. So anyway, go ahead.
So another thought is thinking about the natural law. As soon as I stopped talking, I was thinking about people that I know that worship Mother Nature. And this feels like a very backwards kind of authority, where it's a sense of like putting authority on the kind of primal instinct instead of saying like this, like nature is wild and ought to be tamed. But instead saying like, this is the prime authority.
Right.
And we should serve it instead of tame it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, Lewis calls it the dark gods of the blood. Right?
So the reason I bring this up is for my PhD, I'm reading Alistair McIntyre, and he is a proponent of what he calls virtue ethics. One of the big problems as you progress through the book is it's hard for everyone to agree on what the virtues actually are, right? Like, what are all the virtues? Okay, fine, we all agree with virtue ethics. What are they, right? And obviously Nietzsche has some ideas about certain things that we would call virtues, right? And how do you get at them? And that's part of his problem, is not everybody can agree on the virtues. And so one thing that my advisor said, that take it or leave it, but it goes in line with what a lot of you guys were saying. He said he thinks you need to supplement natural law or virtue ethics with some sort of divine command theory, right? And that's the idea that God tells us, right? And these are the standards, and God tells us, yes, there may be some natural law associated with it, and we can maybe arrive at some of the virtues through understanding nature and reason, et cetera, but he also associates some divine command theory as being a pretty important component as well if you're trying to develop some sort of ethical stance or standard. And so again, that is in agreement essentially with what Nietzsche is identifying here, right? And a lot of his contemporaries did not see. And yet here we see the result in moral relativism being all over the place out there. The individual I was talking with, they said, if religion is about being a good person, what if you can be a good person without religion? Does that make religion obsolete or irrelevant, right? And so that was another fun aspect of the conversation, right? But again, where does this come from? It comes from all this stuff we're talking about, right? Like that, it seems so natural, so obvious for this individual I was talking with to say that, right? Like, surely a lot of people have this idea that religion is just put in place by the powerful and the rich, and they want to maintain their power. Like, obviously, duh. You can be a good person without being religious. I don't know why you need to have religion, right? Seems so obvious, seems so natural to them, and yet here's the background of where all that stuff comes from in terms of the fundamental thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, the problem is you can't actually identify what a good person is. Like within the last 100 years, Nazis convinced themselves killing people was a good thing. Today they're killing infants, and is it a virtuous thing, or like it's for the kid's best interest not come into this world? It's like, if you don't have, how do you even decide what the virtues are at that point?
Right. And I think this goes back to the caught not taught. There's a reason you think that XYZ things are good, right? That was like a cultural mimesis that you just like absorbed, and it happened to have a lot of Christian values at its root. But you rejected the Christian values, and yet, you rejected the Christian foundation explicitly, but you're still kind of like maintaining this spirit or error of the ethical standards that come about because of that faith, right? So it's very interesting. There's a really good book by Tom Holland. Not the actor. There's an actor, Tom Holland. He essentially makes the case. I forget what the book is called. What's it called? Just talk about it. He wrote a book where he essentially goes down through history, and he argues that our entire culture and society is based on Christianity, right? And he's an unbeliever. He's an unbeliever, but he like argues the whole thing. And at the end of the book, he basically says I think it's called Dominion. It's the name of the book. Dominion. Just talk around it. He wrote a book called Dominion. It's hundreds of pages. I didn't finish it, right? But it's absolutely incredible. Like he comes to the conclusion. He's like, I'm a Christian. I don't believe any of this stuff. I'm a Christian, right? And that's what he's wrestling with. He's like, I believe all of the virtues and the values and the morality of Jesus. I just don't believe that God exists or like that Jesus was God or anything like that. But I can't deny that my fundamental ethical and moral orientation is Christian through and through, right? And so it's just very interesting. There are some secular thinkers really grappling with this in our day and age, right? This is a fairly recent book within the last 10 years or so. Yeah.
Well, and again, on the other side, on the fringe, on the alt-right, there's people coming to that kind of conclusion and saying, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't accept all these things that are being Christian. Like
there you
all of
go.
this, all you consider, you're just weak,
right?
Because you're unwilling to confront the truth that
there you go.
God doesn't exist, and you're accepting all these ideas about mercy and kindness and pity.
Back to Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly.
And Nietzsche is actually having a resurgence. Well, there you go, right? All right, guys, we've gone over time. I don't have time to get into Oscar Wilde. Very intriguing as well, and I think it's fitting because in the chapter you can see Oscar Wilde is like underneath Nietzsche, right, for Truman, and so I'll skip him, but I think he's a very interesting figure in and of himself. I will say there is rumors that Oscar Wilde converted on his deathbed. Okay, so just interesting. Rumors about a Catholic Father Cuthbert Dunn. He was a Passionist priest that he helped Oscar Wilde in his deathbed conversion. So,
And fun fact, Oscar Wilde totally performed in the Tabor Opera House, and there used to be a really cool absinthe bar in town called Wilde's Green Hour dedicated to him that no longer exists. So Leadville has some Oscar Wilde admirational history.
there you go.
Okay.
Now you know. And so let's skip him. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close, and then we will be dismissed. Father God, we thank you so much for all you've done for us, all your grace and mercy. Please be with us this week as we continue to think about these ideas, wrestle with them, Lord God. I pray that you'd help us to put the pieces together, Lord, and just give us wisdom as we seek to understand and navigate the world in which we live, Lord God. Help us to be good witnesses for Christ. Help us to share positively who you are and what you've done on our behalf, Lord God, and please guide and direct our steps. We love you, Lord. We thank you for all your grace. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed. Thank you.